In the writing of Georg Simmel, for instance, you will find that there is a discussion about the effect of metropolitan life on the mind. In fact, the essay is titled "The Metropolis and Mental Life," and Simmel talks about whether there is some kind of uh, um, anonymity, individualization, and so on. That is very much a consequence of urban social life. This set of readings deals with this. The reason why this is the first theme in our 12 class, these 12 sets of readings, is because it this is the one that actually deals with at with the with urbanism from a psychosocial perspective. Most of the others will be dealing with social interaction, social structure, spatial structure, and all of that. But this is the one which actually deals with how human nature, psychology, mental life, how are these things affected by living and experiencing cities. So that's broadly what where we are coming from here. So what we'll do now is one of you will volunteer to read one of these excerpts, then someone else will do the other, and so on. And after each, or maybe after a few, we'll have a short discussion on all of them. So who wants to read? Shravan, not you. Anybody else wants to read? Volunteer? Any volunteers?
Yeah, may I read?
Yes, please go ahead. Who's talking? Aradhya. Okay, good.
Aradhya. Just a minute, I'll just connect my earphones and then I'll
Okay,
start.
fine, fine. Yeah, yeah. Take your time.
Is the Zoom fine? Should I?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you're a little soft.
Sometimes it
You
gets
can
clear
probably
then.
speak louder. Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
The deepest problems of modern life derive from the claim of the individual to preserve the autonomy and individuality of his existence in the face of overwhelming social forces, of historical heritage, of external culture, and of the technique of life. The most profound reason, however, why the metropolis conduces to the urge for the most individual person existence, no matter whether justified and successful, appears to me to be the following. The development of modern culture is characterized by the preponderance of what one may call the objective spirit over the subjective spirit. This is to say, in language as well as in law, in the technique of production as well as in art, in science as well as in the objects of the domestic environment, there is embodied a sum of spirit. The individual, in his intellectual development, follows the growth of this spirit very imperfectly and at an ever increasing distance. The individual is reduced to a negligible quantity. Oh, just a minute, I lost where I was. Yeah. The individual is reduced to a negligible quantity, perhaps less in his consciousness than in his practice, and in the totality of his obscure emotional states that are derived from this practice. The individual has become a mere cog in an enormous organization of things and powers which tear from his hands all progress, spirituality, and value in order to transform them from subjective form into the form of a purely objective life. It needs merely to be pointed out that the metropolis is the genuine arena of this culture which outgrows all personal life. Here, in buildings and educational institutions, in the wonders and comforts of space conquering technology, in the formations of community life, and in the visible institutions of the state, is offered such an overwhelming fullness of crystallized and impersonalized spirit that the personality, so to speak, cannot maintain itself under its impact. On the other hand, life is made infinitely easy for the personality in that stimulations, interests, use of time and consciousness are offered to it from all sides. They carry the person as if in a stream, and one needs hardly to swim for oneself. On the other hand, however, life is composed more and more of these impersonal contents and offerings which tend to displace the genuine personal colorations and incomparabilities. This results in the individual summoning the utmost in uniqueness and particularization. In order to preserve his most personal core, he has to exaggerate this personal element in order to remain audible even to himself. The atrophy of individual culture through the hypertrophy of objective culture is one reason for the bitter hatred which the preachers of the most extreme individualism, all above all Nietzsche, harbor against the metropolis. But it is indeed also a reason why these preachers are so passionately loved in the metropolis, and why they appear to the metropolitan man as the prophets and saviors of his most unsatisfied yearnings.
Just scroll down, Shravan. Is this the is this all or it continues?
It's the second reading here.
Okay,
There's
that's it. Okay, this excerpt. All right. So, did you guys follow? Does anybody have any comments or responses to this text? I mean, even if you kind of get a sense of what it is trying to say and you want to explain it, that is fine as well. Of course, it's it's an excerpt, so it's not the full argument. So nobody is expecting you to understand it completely. But even if you get a general gist of what is being said here, it's fine.
I
Anyone?
think when you say that when you're in the city, everything is so impersonal that you have to like really exaggerate certain qualities which you identify yourself with, even to like recognize yourself.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
even you get lost in the city
Hmm.
as yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, and this is where I think one important strand of thought that emerges from much of this earlier work in urban studies, is the idea that urban life is actually a life of large institutions. Uh, it is uh, when we talk about cities, we talk about population, population size and so on. We speak about it almost assuming that there are 12.5 million people living in Mumbai. Okay, but it's not just 12.5 million people living in a small geographical area. These 12.5 million people are organized, relate to one another through the institutions of everyday life, and these institutions include things like family, educational institutions, your employers and employees, your workplace, for instance, government institutions, associations, neighborhood locality associations. We are all part of numerous of these institutions, whether formal or informal, right? And it is through these institutions that our roles are organized in society. So when sociologists study human social life, they don't simply study what people think as individuals. They try to understand how people think as collectives, as institutions, organized in their institutional roles. The way we behave is shaped to a large extent by the institutions to which we belong, right? And what that also does is, because of that kind of relating to one another through often very large institutions, there is also a degree of loss of personalization and particularity of individuals. We tend to feel that that we are not we tend to get homogenized in many ways, right? You are a student, for instance, out of many thousands, tens of thousands of students in the city. You are a citizen. You are a member of a particular neighborhood or something like that, right? So you're always part of some large group of people, and in a sense completely departicularized. And that is a result of living in a city. Now that has a positive side as well, where it creates anonymity, right? So if you live in a large city, you can be invisible almost. You may not even, probably sometimes not even know your neighbors. Whereas if you live in a small community, a village of say 50 households, everybody knows everybody. You're constantly um, scrutinized by people who know you, and you know, I mean, your behavior is shaped to a large extent by the people around you. In a city, that is, you can escape all of that, right? So the city has both these effects. It alienates, but it also liberates. And that is the interesting dynamic of urban life. This ability to negotiate both the alienating effects as well as its liberatory effects is what even Simmel is trying to talk about. So we invent different ways of becoming unique. You know, so in fashion, for instance, this kind of stuff that we wear, which makes us different from others, or our tastes, or the kind of things we do, and so on. You know, these are ways of telling ourselves that we are unique, in a largely depersonalized world. So this is the kind of, in a way, this passage is an exploration into the psychology of urban life. That's what Simmel is trying to do. Now, one of the intentions of this course is that, you know, these readings are very short. We are essentially giving you one paragraph or so, but the idea is that once these are introduced, we trust that, you know, at some point in your life you'll be interested to go and probably look at the larger reading yourself. So it's an introduction, so to speak, to these authors and their ideas, and then you can pursue them later, if you like. Okay, why did that screen disappear? Somebody stop sharing. There it is, back again. Okay.
I'm not sure. The meeting came up for a second.
Okay.
Also, one interesting thing about the sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. I found it very interesting when they talk about like a mere cog, because it actually kind of resonates, like, you know, how you are as a person when someone else sees you. Like tomorrow, if I'm in a smaller town and I'm working at something, I'll be Shravan, the architect. But here in the big city, I'm just seen as Shravan, the architect. That's if I graduate, but not the point here. Like I'm still seen as like my label or my whatever I'm doing for a person. Like I'm not Shravan, your neighbor. I'm your neighbor.
Yeah.
Or I'm not the, you know, I'm the guy walking on the street. I'm the guy in the other restaurant. I'm not like Shravan to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, but I mean, you can always, you can very well ask, what is Shravan, you know, or what is whoever, you know, what is Fleur, or what is the way in which we understand ourselves and understand others is through the roles that we play in society, right? So you are educated as an architect. You're going to be a professional architect. That is one of your roles. But there are many other roles. So, and different people who relate to you through those different roles are going to have very different ideas, conceptions of you. And it is all of those put together that is perhaps what you are, or maybe you are more than that, or less than that, or whatever, you know. So it's the question of who you are, what others think you are, and what you think others think you are, and so on. It's this constant kind of navigation of those three questions, essentially. But the cog in the machine idea is basically that, which is what I was saying. You know, we are all part of large institutions, and we play a particular role in them, right? So, for instance, if I look at myself, I'm a teacher in this institution, but I'm one of the many teachers, and also replaceable, right? So if I, you can get someone else with my qualifications, and it will be a replacement. So that makes me a cog in the machine, right? And this is in my workplace, but in every other way, you are a cog in the machine, in the sense that if you are a worker on an assembly line, you can be replaced. If you are a intern in an office, you can be. If you are a government official, you can be. This is what makes us all, in a sense, cogs in the machine. If the machine is larger than us, and and it kind of makes us less important than we would think or we would like to be. That is essentially what he's trying to say. Okay, I think we should go to the next one now. And who would like to volunteer to read? What are we reading now? Shravan, can you scroll down?
Yeah, I scroll down.
Yeah,
Paul Robert E. Ernest W.
Park, not Paul, Park.
Park Robert.
Okay, who wants to read this?
Can I read?
No.
I don't mind reading.
Yeah, go ahead then.
The city is something more than a congeries of individual men and of social conveniences, streets, buildings, electric lights, tramways and telephones, etc. Some more also than a mere constellation of institutions and administrative devices, courts, hospitals, schools, police and civil functionaries of various sorts. The city is rather a state of mind, a body of customs and traditions, and of the organized attitudes and sentiments that inhere in these customs and are transmitted with this tradition. The city is not, in other words, merely a physical mechanism and an artificial construction. It is involved in the vital processes of the people who compose it. It is a product of nature and particularly of human nature. The city is not merely a geographical and ecological unit, it is at the same time an economic unit. The economic organization of the city is based on the division of labor, the multiplication of occupations and professions within the limits of the urban population is one of the most striking and least understood aspects of the modern city life. From this point of view, we may, if we choose, think of the city, that is to say, the place and the people, with all the machinery and the administrative devices that go with them, as organically related. A kind of psychological mechanism in and through which private and political interests find not merely a collective but a corporate expression. The city is finally the natural habitat of a civilized man.
Okay, good. So what we'll do is we'll read the number 3 as well, and then discuss both of them together because they are very similar. So anybody else wants to read reading number 3?
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one second. Yeah. Uh, the multiplication of persons in a state of interaction under conditions which make their contact as full personalities impossible produces that segmentalization of human relationships which has sometimes been seized upon by students of the mental life of the cities as an explanation for the schizoid character of urban personality. This is not to say that the urban inhabitants have fewer acquaintances than rural inhabitants, for the reverse may actually be true. It means rather than in relation to the number of people whom they see and with whom they rub elbows in the course of daily life, they know a smaller proportion of these, they have less intensive knowledge. Characteristically, characteristically, urbanities meet one another in highly segmental roles. They are, to be sure, dependent upon more people for the satisfactions of their life needs than are rural people, and thus are associated with greater number of organized groups. But they are less dependent upon particular persons, and their dependence upon others is confined to a highly fractionalized aspect of others' round of activity. This is essentially what is meant by saying that the city is characterized by secondary rather than primary contacts. The contacts of the city may indeed be face to face, but they are nevertheless impersonal, superficial, transitory, and segmental. The reverse, the indifference, and the blaze outlook, which urbanities manifest in their relationships may thus be regarded as devices for immunizing themselves against the personal claims and expectations of others. The superficiality and the anonymity and the transitory character of urban social relations make intelligible also the sophistication and the rationality generally ascribed to city dwellers. Our acquaintances tend to stand in a relationship of utility to us in the sense that the role which one plays in our life is overwhelmingly regarded as means for the achievement of our own ends, whereas the individual gains on the one hand a certain degree of emancipation or freedom from the personal and emotional controls of intimate groups, he loses on the other hand the spontaneous self-expression, the morale, and the sense of participation that comes with living in an integrated society. This constitutes essentially the state of anomia or the social void to which Durkheim
alludes in attempting to account for the various forms of social disorganization in technological society. Yeah.
Okay. Um, so, uh, all right. So some of these things in the first essay we already touched upon, but basically now in these two passages, you see the argument developing even further. Hmm? One of the things that you will notice, if you think about it, actually, many of these things we don't think about very much because we are naturalized into them, right? It's something that we have lived all our lives, so we don't tend to think about it very much. Sometimes it's only distance that gives you perspective. So if you think about this a little, you'll recognize that um, there is the in urban life you have um, you know and you relate to many more people than you would if you lived in more smaller communities, which is actually which each of us can attest to this as a fact. We know many more people, we interact with many of them, but the nature of interaction is very different. um, each person you interact with has a certain um, specific relationship with you in a specific domain. It's segmental. You relate to some people as your friends in college, for instance. You know some people as your neighbors and friendly neighbors, let's say. Then there are some people that you interact with as your teachers and your associates and so on. Some people are your employers and so on, right? So there are different kinds of people who you interact with for different needs and different functions, let's say. And this is what is very important to understand in large modern societies. There is an important sociologist named Emil Durkheim, so who speaks about this quite a lot in all of his work, and he talks about what's called what he calls mechanical societies and organic societies. Basically societies that are based on mechanical relationships where everybody is like everybody else. So I mean, just think about it. If you were kind of born 400-500 years ago in a small um, rural settlement, you would probably be an artisan or a craftsperson or maybe a peasant or someone, and you would realize that people who you relate to are very similar to you. Probably the same ethnic group, probably the same religious beliefs, probably the same occupations even, or very similar kinds of occupations. So each person in that society is very like other people in that society. If you look at modern societies, Durkheim says, you have a great degree of specialization. People are very different from each other, not in the biological sense, but in the sense of life experiences, people they interact with, the kind of expertise that they have, the professions that they are in, the things that they do, and so on. And we are all very different and very specialized roles. So there is what he calls a division of labor. And division of labor not only in the sense of factory work, but division of labor in society as a whole, where each of us play a different role and different specialized role and so on, and we get educated into those roles and so on, right? Now, what Durkheim says is, and this is a very interesting argument that he makes, he calls the earlier forms of societies mechanical and modern organic, which you would think is counterintuitive, right? Because organic means you would think it's closer to nature and all that, whereas mechanical means machine-like and so on. But what Durkheim is trying to talk about as organic being very much like an organism. So for Durkheim, modern society is very much like an organism. You have organs in your body. Each of them are specialized. They have specialized roles and so on. The cells in each of them have specific functions, and they can only live there, they can't live in other organs, and so on, right? So this kind of so in your body there is a certain kind of division of labor, division of functions, let's say. Hmm? Similarly, in modern societies, you have people who are almost belong to different organs, and these organs interact with each other, and so on. And for Durkheim, this is not so much of a it's a very interesting kind of phenomenon, because what happens is, because of this kind of specialization and diversity, there is also a very, very deep and intricate interdependence, right? The heart cannot live without the lungs, for instance, and the liver cannot live without the circulatory system, and so on, right? So there is an interdependency and interrelationships between these different organs and functions, and so on, and that really characterizes modern life. So even though modern life uh, has many different people, lots of people living in extremely close proximity, each of these people who belong to that collectivity have extremely specialized, specific roles, but they are also interdependent on each other, and that is what makes modern life so complex and intricate, but also interdependent, and it creates a certain kind of solidarity of based on specialization, not on similarity. So that's essentially, and urban life is probably the most um, uh, uh, obvious form of this kind of solidarity of solidarity based on difference and specialization. Okay.
Yeah. I think another important aspect is that how the three essays that we read today are connected. Because I think in the first essay, again, I mean, we spoke about individual versus, the collective, and how in urban societies, the individualism becomes important, as opposed to, how this kind of collective life or kind of community which is there in rural society. What Durkheim also argues when he makes a distinction between traditional and modern societies is that the notion of the collective or the community is central to the traditional societies where there's mechanical solidarity, because people are similar. They also are, kind of, there are customs, there are traditions, there are institutions that bind them, the way decisions are made collectively, and the way the society functions is very different as opposed to modern society. And in traditional societies, individualism is not so important because people may not have so many individual freedoms. There is always, like, if you live in a traditional society, you are always kind of afraid of what the collective will do, or what will happen if you do something, and you do not necessarily, you're not necessarily free to act in a manner uh, as you would probably want to. What changes in a modern society is that with the division of labor and these relationships between people also become more impersonal, there is also the rise of individuality and the rise of individual freedom. And that is also another aspect that distinguishes a modern society from traditional society. And this individual freedom is something that and although people are free to do as they please, and so anybody will be acting in their own individual interest. So many people have critiqued this kind of model, saying that individualism is a problem because individual freedom means that there will be chaos. But one realizes that in modern societies, where there is with the rise of individual freedom, there is also an importance to or a rise in certain institutions and values which speak of responsibilities towards one another. So it's not just freedom that allow people to act in any which way and do whatever they want, but it also involves institutions where these concepts such as justice, equality, freedom fraternity become very central. And that is the difference between these two types of societies, which it actually comes up in different ways in these three essays.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Do you guys have any comments or questions, or we can go to the last passage? Sure. Yeah.
There's a picture in the second one. I didn't really understand that what this kind of diagram is supposed to
Just go to
represent.
that and zoom in. Just zoom in.
I think this feature is a bit slow.
Yeah. So this is a kind of a model of urban settlements, of the city. Now, obviously, it's a very abstract model, and it's and also what's important is that this is a very American model of the city. So you can see that that downtown is the slum and the ghetto and so on. And as you go outside, you have single family dwellings and residential hotels and so on. It's a very American kind of urban model. Obviously, this is very different. If you look at the urban model in European cities, if you look at the urban model in Indian cities, colonial cities, post-colonial cities, new post-colonial cities, and so on, they're all very different. So this is an early attempt at trying to create a certain diagram of social social life in the city, hmm, into these kind of residential zones. In the subsequent classes, we'll be looking, when we look at other, when we do say colonial cities, you'll also see an attempt to do this for Indian cities as well. And there's one for Bombay as well, which is very interesting. But what these models help you to do is try to think about the city as in its abstract structure. So, for instance, if you think about Bombay city like this, you will realize that Bombay city also has a certain kind of a structure, a spatial demographic structure, you can call it. And obviously, this has to do with its history and so on. But you will see that there is a colonial core, and which is which is where the fort began, and then a certain kind of suburban expansion. There was the native town and the white town, and then later on there was the industrial um, uh, areas and the housing associated with that, and then the suburbanization, suburban sprawl, and so on. So you see a certain kind of structure emerging, and you can diagrammatize that. So this is an attempt to do that, right? Only thing is, this is a very American one, and it is trying to generalize the pattern of urbanization in American cities. We can attempt that for our own cities or any other type of city as well. But so this is one of the early diagrams. That's all. I mean, it's included in the essay, in this particular essay, and we thought it was an interesting diagram to include in this document as well. Okay. Chalo, let's move to the
when America
number. Yeah. Bol, Shravan, bol.
So when someone in America refers to an inner city, is this referring the same idea? Like, because I'm noting a lot of
in America you don't say inner city. In America you say downtown, and generally downtown is a term for where the poor blacks and Latinos live. That's the poorer areas of the city is downtown, and then you have the generally the middle class lives in suburbs, and that's the classic American urban settlement pattern, which is different in European cities, because in early European cities you had the core of the city was generally a citadel and a market, and and usually the rich would live in the core cities and the poor would live in the peripheries, and you see that in European cities even more and more.
Right.
In our cities, it's a very depending on what kind of city it is. So, for instance, Bombay being a colonial city, has a specific urban pattern. But if you look at cities which were not directly under colonial rule, which were princely states and so on, they have a very different, distinct urban pattern. So you can, depending on the historic and social formative factors, you will see different kinds of urban models, and you can try to diagrammatize them if you want.
Thank you.
Okay.
And I think the reason for this diagrammatization is the diagram is not just talking about. I think in that essay we were talking about. He was talking about the city is not just a physical entity. It's not just about buildings and infrastructure and industry and different kinds of land use and what you see in space. But he's talking about it as an outcome of certain social relations. So it's what's being mapped in these diagrams is socio-spatial relations. It's certain people, in a colonial city because of a colonial policy of spatial segregation. You have white town which has a very distinct geographical, distinct geographical entity which is separated from the native town. So here, this idea of racial segregation has actually resulted in this particular kind of formation. And where certain communities live in the city and are located geographically is also a relation, also an outcome of these social spatial relations, which are being diagrammatized in these models.
Yeah. Also, just to add to Shweta's point, is that when we talk about, you see, cities are one important aspect to understand, and you guys are all architects, so this is something that we should come very naturally to us when we think about space. Is that when you do studies of space, location is extremely important, and location defined by where you are with respect to what, you know so you can see that location is very important just by looking at property prices. If you go to the to the um, to South Bombay, you will see that property prices are very high. Why? you know uh, there is there are important reasons why property prices are high there, and they are lower when you go away from the city, right? Because that is where the most intense institutions and institutional interactions are. That's where opportunities are most in the city, with economic, social, and political opportunities. That's why it's no surprise that the government headquarters and big banks and big corporate firms are all extremely closely clustered together in maybe 1 or 2 square kilometers, right? So those are the kind of intricate social networks that exist at that point. So location becomes very important, and that's the reason when you diagrammatize in these models, you will also see what is where with respect to what, and what does that tell you, in terms of its importance, its status, its position, its and how it affects each other, right? So that's basically what these diagrams help you understand.
Yeah. In fact, in Bombay, also like certain natural features also play an important role. So you see, the Western Shore has a certain kind of development, and the nature of development or who stays there is very different from what has happened to the east of the railway line. So I think, of course, there are multiple factors which overlap and lead to these distinct geographies, spatial geographies. But I think it's important to understand how these will help us read the city. So like, which is why that there cannot be any standardized diagram. That model was meant for American cities, but if you start developing your own model for coastal cities, for instance, you will probably see new patterns emerge, right? And then there are coastal colonial cities which are probably different from the cantonment towns. So again, it's not like Indian cities will all have the same pattern. There are different cities which came up in different socio-political contexts, which evolved in certain conditions, and that is what led to those distinct geographies.
Yeah. Okay. So the last one. Who wants to read this?
Can I?
Yeah.
I am concerned not only with the uniqueness and limits of various cities, but also with the city as a distinctly human and cultural terrain. A city is more, in my view, than an epiphenomenon of a broad division of labor between agriculture and crafts or barter and commerce. It is a world in its own right that goes beyond familial, tribal, economic, and social ties to establish a uniquely political universe of its own. For all its collectivism and strong bonds of solidarity, tribal societies are surprisingly parochial. Based on kinship, however fictitious in its reality, the tribe rooted its affiliations in lineage ties, or what I call the blood oath. The city, by contrast, over a long period of development, created a more universal terrain, the realm of the citizen. Civic rights depended upon residence rather than a shared ethnic background, even upon wealth rather than common descent. In any case, it formed the arena for the emergence of a common humanity rather than a parochial folk. Here, the stranger could first find a home and the protection of laws, and later citizenship as one among equals, not the arbitrary treatment that characterizes the status of visitors to tribal communities. From a distance of millennia, it is hard for people to realize what a social and cultural revolution the step out of the lineage system provided to be. Aside from the sense of universality, it produced the variety and openness to different cultural stimuli it created made the city the most powerful civilizing factor in human history. The origin of the word civilization from civitas is not accidental. It authentically reflects the emergence of a distinctly human culture, universal in its scope from city life as such.
Yeah, thanks so much. So, this essay is very different from the earlier three. And if you look at the date, you will also realize that this is the most recent. It's written by Murray Bookchin, who was a radical, who was an anarchist thinker, extremely polemical and very committed to social emancipation. And his perspective obviously is extremely pro urban life, as you can sense, right? Now it's interesting if you think about it that when if you look back at Indian history, recent Indian history, obviously, post independence or just pre independence, in India there were various extremely contradictory attitudes towards the city. So, for instance, in the work of Gandhi, you will find a very strong anti-urban bias. If you read, say, Hind Swaraj, industrial civilization as a whole is condemned, by Gandhi as as a as a destructive force. For him, what is important is the small village communities that exist all over the country, which are basically governed by traditional institutions. So in that sense, Gandhi was a thorough conservative, and even his economic vision was based on the vision of village republics. In fact, each village being a republic of its own, autonomous, interdependent, based on caste, caste as a organizing institution, and so on. So that was Gandhi's social vision, essentially. Whereas Nehru came from a very different perspective, was a modernizer, was very Anglophile, largely very inspired by the Victorian traditions and so on, and then later Soviet influence, socialist influence as well. And for him, post-independence, the city was an important site for modernization, right? And that's why huge investments in public works, sounds, the Nehruvian vision.
Sam, you're not quite audible. Your voice kind of broke and then. Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes. I think that was the point where
Yeah.
your audio broke.
Where did I go off? Where did I go off?
You were talking. I think I missed it, but you were
Yeah.
talking
No, so
about the.
you can see a certain kind of intermixture, I was saying, and
Yeah.
you also see, I mean, what is, I forgot what I was saying. 1 second, let me quickly gather my thoughts. Um, hmm, Yeah. So if you look at, I mean, this Bombay's history, despite being, colonial and capitalist, there was one thing that Bookchin talks about, which is really, which comes out very, very strongly, is that the city is not a collection of institutions. It is a different institution in itself. That is what he's essentially arguing. He's saying it's a very unique form of civilizing force in human history. Never before did so many different people of with different ethnic, cultural backgrounds come together and live in such proximity, right? And 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 forge new ways of relating to one another in terms of collective uh, categories like the citizen. I mean, if you think about the concept of citizen, it's very interesting. You are not a citizen based on your religion or based on your bloodline or your income or your class or anything like that, right? You're a citizen, which comes from where you live. Essentially, the city that you belong to or the country that you belong to. Now, obviously, the nation itself is a fictitious entity. That's a different story. But still, within that within that geographical political unit, there is a certain idea of equality which is embedded within it, right? And many of these other specificities of your identity are underplayed when you refer to it. So this is what Bookchin is talking about. The city is actually the political institution that created the citizen, and um, all of what we call modern civilized life is essentially rooted in urban life, according to Bookchin at least. Hmm? And now, when you think about our own cities from that perspective, you tend to think, is that really something that we are seeing? Is Bombay cosmopolitan today? Why is it not? And how has it happened that a society which is essentially based on the erase or the underplaying of difference is something that creates such stark inequalities as well, right? So these are really interesting questions for us to think about. How did the city, a city which was based on a cosmopolitan culture, become decosmopolitanized? And how did that happen? And what were the changes? And how did that change the way the city even is even organized? I mean, today if you look at neighborhoods in the city, they are very divided, which was not the case earlier. They were more porous earlier, right? So you see the city changing as well when its culture shifts. Hmm? So these are questions, interesting questions for us to think about as well when we reflect on our own places that we all come from. Hmm? So yeah, I think that is all I have to say about this. Yeah, if anybody has anything to contribute, we can discuss it or we can close.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, now I have one more point to add. I think Hussain already referred to Gandhi and Nehru and their two distinct, visions or imaginations of, Gandhi's romanticization of the village and Nehru's kind of approach towards, modernization and modernity. And one also sees in this, I think, when Bookchin talks about the city as a kind of a place where it's an emergence of a common humanity rather than a parochial folk, right? So here the stranger could find a home and the protection of laws and later citizenship among as one amongst equals, not the arbitrary treatment and characteristics that characterizes the status of visitors to tribal community. So I want to bring up this point that another one of our political leaders pointed out. He differed from Gandhi in the sense that while Gandhi romanticized the village and he said that India lives in its villages, there was Ambedkar who was actually one of the leaders of the anti-caste movement who, in fact, uh, encouraged people to move to cities and to embrace urban life because he felt that that was something that would help them escape the parochial society and the oppressive caste system in villages. So that is another imagination of how cities have been kind of spoken of by one of our leaders. So I think there are many different kinds of themes that this set of essays brings up, and because and I think those can be subsequently elaborated on and discussed in further classes.
Yeah, thanks for that. No, I think this is an important point. In fact, which I missed while I was talking, because even though Nehru was was committed to a certain kind of modernity. However, there was also the in Nehru there was a certain degree of ambivalence when it came to India's past. Whereas in the works of Ambedkar, you would see that there is a decisive break, and the essence of Bookchin's passage that you just read actually is closer to Ambedkar's vision of an egalitarian society than Nehru's vision of a certain kind of a modern yet state-based, society. So I think that's important to recognize as well. So thanks, Shweta, for bringing that up. Okay, if you guys have any more questions or comments, or should we close for today? All right. So next week, then we are going to look at the question of urban revolution, which is the explosion of urban society historically. So that is what the next set of readings are about, and we'll upload them maybe in a couple of days, and then you can read them before you come to class, so you are at least familiar with it. All right. Okay. I'm stopping recording now, and we'll see you guys next week. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank